appreciate the opportunity. As Susan mentioned, we are going to talk about myocardial protection for the next few minutes, and there we go. And to go over some of the aspects that everybody in the room is aware of from a historical perspective, talk about where the future is, and look at a snapshot of where we are in America today with myocardial protection. But before we begin, I'd like to draw our attention to what we're trying to protect. And if you look at just the regular physiology that's associated with myocardial function and put some tongue-in-cheek numbers up there, you could see that we have over 3 billion beats in a lifetime. And looking at the liters that we're pumping out over a lifetime, we can see that we're somewhere over 200 million liters that are performed. And those of us who are perfusionists who perform this function every day, if you're on for 60 minutes on bypass flowing at 5 liters per minute, we're up around 3,000 liters, or somewhere between that level, or 300 to 3,000, I guess, depending upon how long you're on bypass. The average length of blood vessels is 60,000 miles. So if you look at what the heart is required to do, and if you were energetically to look at the power that is associated with a lifetime's worth of beating, it would be just about enough to launch this. This is an Iowa-class battleship, which weighs 58,000 tons fully loaded and armed. It would launch that 50 feet in the air. So, clearly what myocardial preservation, protection, cardioplegia, and the events that are associated with preserving function during and throughout cardiac surgery is quite a task. So, as I mentioned, there's only a few objectives that we'll go over today. One is we're going to look at the evolution of myocardial preservation, and I put that as a question mark because once we get to the historical aspects, are we really evolving? And I think that question is up for debate. We'll look at the history and then finally talk about a snapshot in America. Whenever you look at like a Google search or a Library of Medicine, a PubMed search, you come up with loads of citations. And many of these are cross-referenced, so it's not valid really to put this up. But if we do show what's going on in regards to the amount of literature that is out there, with over 400,000 cardiac surgical publications that are there. And if you start looking at myocardial protection and preservation, on the left-hand side in the middle, the adults we can see have the preponderance of them, and pediatrics are well underrepresented. Blood cardioplegia, almost 6,000 presentations, cold and warm and crystalloid. And then if you look at the techniques at the very bottom, we see that primary, retrograde, and antegrade cardioplegia are mentioned. If you look more recently at some of the solutions that are out there, we can see that the custodial type of solutions, HTK, the Brettschneider, has about 112, a few in the pediatrics. Del Nido is starting to appear more and more, and then microplegia and acetylene are represented. But let's do a comparison. Myocardial protection is something that we all do. We do it every single day. Perhaps if you're doing more off-pump than on-pump, you do it a little bit less. But if you wanted to compare that to another well-studied subject matter in the field of cardiac surgery, a good analogy would be blood management. And if you just look historically at it, the first myocardial protective techniques were described in literature in 1955. The first blood management techniques probably predate 53, but I just chose that, of course, by the first successful cardiopulmonary bypass procedure. There are multiple techniques in both. A few of them are just shown here, and we know that if you look at some outcome measures, measuring blood management is very easy to look at outcome measures. We do a lot of extrapolation in the injuries that are associated with receiving allogeneic blood products, but for the most part, we can measure chest tube output, we could measure humoral factors within blood. It's pretty straightforward, and of course you could measure how people are transfused. On the other side, the myocardial side, it's a little bit more challenging. There's no really point-of-care assessments that we could use to determine how well a heart has sustained or how injured a heart has become, either ischemia or reperfusion. Systematic reviews, there's tons in blood management. In fact, probably half the people in this room have been participating in the writing of some, and there's very few, with myocardial protection. And to put that into some semblance of a comparison, in 1986, the editor of the Journal of Thoracic and Cardiovascular Surgery was a person named Dwight Magoon, and he published a complete symposia on the number of myocardial protection cardioplegia papers that have been published to that date, and it was voluminous. It was very large. And then something happened that has not been reproduced till this date was the editor of the Journal of Thoracic Cardiovascular Surgery, after Dwight had gone and published an entire issue devoted just to myocardial protection from the UCLA group, headed by Follett and Buckberg. Standardization, guidelines are all over the place. They're ubiquitous. We, of course, quote the STS guidelines, but there are many that predate that, and actually from very valid sources, the ABB, foreign sources that are as equally as good, if not better. None are present for myocardial protection. And then the future in blood transfusion is very good. I mean, we know that we've done a phenomenal job of assessing how we perform as clinicians, anesthetists, perfusionists, or surgeons in minimizing that risk. Myocardial protection, the bets are all off in that area. Let's spend just a couple of minutes talking a review of myocardial protection strategies. One of the problems associated with assessing how preservation is measured is there's such a large degree of dysfunction that's associated from a pathophysiological consequence. And some of these are shown here. Oh, sorry. I'm pressing the button up here and nothing's working, but it's my fault. I didn't have the right tool, so I'll put that in here. There we go. And let's see, does that work? Well, I turned it off. Are there any questions that are associated with? I'm not going to be using that. Yeah, I probably went backwards. I apologize. I'm going to just do this, guys. Sorry. So we know that it's very complex, and we've studied this for decades. I started in 1984, and many of these same subjects were being evaluated back then. We also know that reperfusion injury, it's not just how we're preserving the heart, keeping the ischemic injury from progressing from a recoverable injury into a non-recoverable, which is really the definition of coagulative necrosis of ischemic injury. It's absolutely confounded by the fact that reperfusion occurs. And these, if you look historically, were described as the oxygen and calcium paradoxes. When we look at some of the other terms that are out there, myocardial stunning, those who practice with ECMO or VADS know this very well. The reason we put patients on long-term circulatory support is to hopefully recover the heart if it's not a bridge to transplant. And then last year at this meeting, we talked a little bit about preconditioning. A lot of people believe it probably doesn't occur. Not a lot of good research to support that it is happening, but at least in the experimental conditions, if you do have an ischemic event followed by a subsequent ischemic event, the cellular mechanisms that are associated with recovery are supposedly enhanced. Myocardial protection and preservation we use interchangeably. Cardioplegia, the first time this was used in the literature was in 1955 is when it occurred, and it's simply described as a series of interactions aimed to limit injury associated with the performance of those clinicians and then that are conducted during bypass. How do we preserve? What do we do to help the heart? Number of areas: chemical, hypothermia, rheological changes, hydraulics. These are all aspects of perfusion that are associated with the performance of cardioplegia that we all are very well aware of and that we perform daily. There's really two broad classifications of cardioplegia solutions. We'll talk about them very briefly. There's the intercellular formulation, which is based upon a hyperkalemic formula, and then there's the extracellular, which is a hyponatremic formula, and we'll talk about these because they really evolved separated by the Atlantic Ocean, depending upon where you were using this technique. What they're trying to do, though, they're trying to make the heart refractory to any type of electrical stimuli, which will decouple electromechanical function so that the heart is not consuming energy at a time period where it's being hypoperfused or hypooxygenated. And the way to do that, the Nernst equation that we all learned in our basic training said if you can raise that resting membrane potential to negative 60, from negative 80, the heart cannot be stimulated. You can't charge it. And that's the basis of one commercially available cardioplegia solution. And if you do this, you, of course, preserve energetic function. There's a number of chemical additives. Everybody in the room here probably has their own formula. I remember when I was at Nebraska, there was a really nice paper that was published in 1994. That was a survey that went out to all 22 cardiac centers in the state of Missouri on what their techniques were for cardioplegic arrest of the heart, preservation. And there were 22 centers that were queried, and they came back with 26 different formulations in the mid-1990s. So clearly, you know, these chemicals are out there and are being used. Hypothermia, you know, we know this. We know Severinghaus is constant and many other determinants for how cellular activity is reduced with the association of hypothermia. We're using that right now in the ER. Our cardiology brethren, of course, are applying it to infarcts as well as neurological injuries. And we've learned that about, you know, a 5% reduction in metabolic activity, which is specific to the actual tissue itself, an organ, per degree drop in temperature. However, it's not a linear effect, so going deeper doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to sustain that degree of protection, and nobody really knows where that trade-off is. And then we all know, of course, the alkalizing benefit of some agents that really track the neutrality constant of water better, such as histidine, that is found, of course, as the primary blood buffer in a red blood cell. Old quotes, you know, and I put these up for a reason. It's not like, well, I got lazy and just went back into the 90s and pulled these up, but these are absolutely found in every paper published in the history of cardioplegia, going back into the 50s. Demi said it, that a lack of myocardial uniformity and protection because the choice of cardioplegia solution is not as important as how it's delivered. Amen. I mean, how many people here are having, you know, several surgeons that perform different cardioplegia techniques and the outcomes are very, very similar, yet they all swear by those. Others, such as Zaroff, had stated that inadequate protection is the primarily causative factor for putting in VADs, post-operative intra-aortic balloon pumps. And then finally, Mangano from the McSpy database said that the cost of inadequate myocardial protection is probably up to $2 billion a year. So what are the mandates for the optimum strategy? What do we know we have to do? These are the standards that we all apply. Accurate and precise delivery of nutrients and drugs. And you could add to that the washout of the cellular toxic constitutes that are associated with both aerobic and anaerobic metabolism. Adequate flow distribution, you got to get it there, and that of course means getting it past any blockages that are associated specifically with coronary artery disease. Let's talk about the history a little bit. Just go, you know, briefly into this for a couple of minutes because it really is quite exciting. The first individuals to publish, at least to make it to a publication in a renowned a publication such as Lancet, were Melrose and Bentall. Melrose, of course, Bentall is the one who we know very well because of the utilization of aortic surgery. But Dennis Melrose was also extremely prominent publisher at his time. And what they had done is they said, you know what, we're going to take that intracellular formulation that Ringers had described in 1898, and we're going to apply that to the extracellular environment by using a solution we're going to inject directly into the coronaries. And so they said potassium's high inside the cell. That was well known. So let's make potassium high outside the cell. And they chose this particular constituent to go ahead and to arrest the heart. Works great. I mean, you put potassium citrate into a heart, those of you who have run Langendorf preps or, you know, done, say, animal laboratories, and you know you can arrest the heart very quickly. It's a very effective mechanism. But what does citrate do to calcium? You know, it's smart. You know, citrate removes the calcium, so the mechanical activity that are associated with myosin and different enzymatic interactions associated with shortening of sarcomeres were removed. You remove that, unfortunately, because we know that was the prelude to, of course, occurring to the calcium paradox, which is associated with the stone heart. And this was successfully applied in a small number of individuals, and then work in this country by the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute a few years later said, this is bad. Move away from citrate. In 1955, a group of cardiac surgeons and individuals associated with cardiovascular surgery met in Detroit, and this is the very first publication on cardiopulmonary bypass. It was published in 1955, and these were the papers that were presented at that time. And this was a publication by Lillihei showing that using acetylcholine to go ahead and to arrest the heart by injecting it into a coronary artery directly in the infusion line, distance to a bubble detector, a bubble filter, excuse me. And so here is really where cardioplegia first began. A little bit more history. In the 60s, Bretschneider and Kirsch in Germany were identifying the use of hyponatremia. 1963, 1962 were their first publications. That, of course, we know as HTK, cardioplegia, or custodial from a commercial perspective. Buckberg and Dave Hurst. Dave Hurst was working at St. Thomas's Hospital in London. Buckberg, of course, we all know from blood cardioplegia. In fact, his formulation, the 4-to-1 cardioplegia, is the most used cardioplegic formulation in the world today. I'm going to show a little bit of statistics on that in a bit. David Hurst, though, came up with the St. Thomas's cardioplegic solution, and this is where he used the Nernst mechanics. He said, okay, if you raise that messenger membrane potential in -60, we'll go ahead and arrest the heart. He did that, and how he did it was he put 16 milliequivalents of potassium in a liter of solution, and that's what raised it to 60. And that's why if you read a bag of Plegisol today, it's 16 milliequivalents of potassium that are in there were based upon his formulation. He also used magnesium to block calcium, but it was primarily the potassium. In the 1990s, 2000, Philippe Ménacher talked to us about continuous cardioplegia. The warm heart investigators, Sid Levitsky, others were publishing on this as perhaps a way to preserve the heart by keeping an active enzymatic energetic substrate source together so that you can keep the heart functioning. Both of them are not rarely used much anymore. And then this year, we know, or the last decade, we've seen that Delnito has really improved, and we've gone back to Bretschneider. So from the 60s, perhaps due to the commercialization of that solution. Well, what about the devices that are out there? If you do a caloric transfer of heat, this is the most efficient device that is on the market. If you wanted to rapidly cool, forget the 3 T's, which we'll be talking about tomorrow, by the way, but forget those devices, get yourself a bucket and put ice in it. And those of us who've been doing this for a long time, remember, what did we also pour into that ice at that particular time? Alcohol, right. Now we drink it, but back then we were actually going in and placing it in, and we made it actually super cool. And remember chorioathetosis? Those of us who unfortunately lived through that in the 80s and 90s, a lot of people believe it was related to that deep hypothermia. The BCD, blood cardioplegia device, designed by the individual who is now the president of Quest Medical, Ken Jones, who was an engineer at Shiley at the time, designed this device, also called the Buckberg cardioplegia device. And this was the bomb. This is what we all used in the 80s and early 90s. There were millions of these things sold. And then, of course, where we are today. Just a couple of limitations on the devices that we currently use. They have very limited air bubble detection capacity. They do have some filtration methods. They're gross filters, usually 110 microns or above. But they really do suffer from a lot of shortfalls when it comes to myocardial protection. In fact, Effler and Groves, Effler was one of the first individual surgeons at the Cleveland Clinic to do coronary artery bypass graft surgery back in the 50s, and they said that if electrocardiac arrest is strictly an adjunct to open heart operations, if the basic equipment and the resultant perfusion are inadequate, you're not going to be successful. A little bit after this, in early 60, Brian Effler wrote a nice editorial in the Journal of Thoracic and Cardiovascular Surgery poo-pooing cardioplegia. And he said, any cardiac surgeon worth his or her value, if they're using myocardial protection techniques, should be forced to operate with their foot in a bucket of ice water to experience what the heart is going through. So probably a very opinionated individual. Paul Ebert, 1978, was the president of the Society, not the Society of Thoracic Surgeons, the Society of Surgeons. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank right now what the name is, but he's a cardiac surgeon, a pediatric cardiac surgeon, and he ran the Surgical Society of America, and that's not the name, but he was pretty high up, and he stated that potassium and other metabolic components of cardioplegic solutions appears to be less important than actually how you deliver them. Again, we talk about this all the time, about the variation in myocardial protection and why it may or may not work. Well, here's a couple of reasons. One is senescence, and the senescent heart responds completely different to what the developing heart is, and heart failure, we all know, is found to be increasing on a regular basis and has been one of the reasons that VADs and perhaps even a slight increase in ECMO have been occurring. So how do you treat these individuals? Is it the same formulation that you've used on your on every other patient, the 70-year-old who comes in for coronary disease? We started looking about this in the early 80s, and pediatrics, Ed Beauvais and myself wrote a series of papers, these are just a few of them, on protecting the child's heart. How are you going to protect that? What do you got to do different? differently. And we use those preparations that are used still today, the isolated heart preparations, Langendorf and Working. So let's talk about current cardioplegic techniques in America and where we are today. And I think every one of us probably has heard this in the operating room, and you may have heard the opposite to this too. It's like, well, this is the way when I trained at Mass General, I trained at Emory or Mayo, that we did that. Dr. Schaff had taught me in 1978, and we're still doing it today in 2017. That's really where most surgeons develop their myocardial preservation strategies. They use what they've learned in their training sessions. And though some of the challenges that we face as perfusionists is, it'll happen next month after the AATS meeting. It happened in February after the STS meeting, where a surgeon would come home and say, hey, I heard this great presentation. Somebody is, modifying Del Nido to go ahead and to place this particular constituent in. Can we do that tomorrow on the case? How many of us have been charged, usually after one of those 2 surgical meetings, with altering our practice techniques? So let's talk about where we are in America today. And SCOPE is a registry of 1.4 million patients that we maintain at SpecialtyCare. And of those, we have over 300,000 patients that are cardiac surgical patients. It's the second largest registry in the world, only a lot smaller, than the STS database registry. They're at 4 million patients. But we have the opportunity when we use this, SCOPE is called SpecialtyCare Operative Procedural Registry. We have the opportunity to go in and through our biostatisticians who are working in the medical department to go ahead and to find out some descriptive information. So this pie diagram right now was last year's data, approximately 200 hospitals. We did 36,000 some odd cases, and if we go in and look at the adult patients, we can see that microplegia, 4-to-1 blood crystalloid ratio, and Del Nido are the 3 big categories of how cardioplegia is being delivered. There are actually 11 categories that individuals can pull up their information from. And then if we look at the case distribution on those categories, as I mentioned earlier, 4-to-1 is what most people use in America. This is probably a good snapshot. It represents approximately 20% of all hospitals in America performing cardiac surgery. So it's rather robust in its magnitude of data. Microplegia right at 8,000 cases, Del Nido at 6, and then a bunch at none. So those are more than likely the off-pump procedures. An interesting trend is going on right now. We're seeing a change and a diminution in the amount of use of 4-to-1 and microplegia. They're dropping only slightly, but they are going down. And what's increasing is the use of Del Nido cardioplegia as well as modified. And we just added this category recently as a mechanism because we received a lot of emails from our associates, it's 450 perfusionists who work with us, and they said, no, I'm modifying Del Nido. I'm not doing 1-to-4, we're doing 4-to-1. And we put X amount of lidocaine in instead of what the standard formulation are. So we realized it's not accurate just to say, are you using Del Nido or not, because it's an apples and orange comparison. So what I'd like to do is just spend a couple of minutes before we conclude talking about a subset of those individuals to look at in regards to what's happening with one of the big areas of myocardial protection, and a lot of that is based on volumetrics. So we took this subset of 16,700 patients or so, and we chose these 4 categories, the 3 big ones because those were the most we're doing, and then the HTK group, custodial, because we just wanted to see what a pure crystalloid solution, what type of effects it would have. So we put that in as an outlier. And then we did a performance structure, and I'm only presenting a very small snapshot of the data. We've done propensity analysis, balance scoring, regression analysis, but I'm really just looking at some of the descriptive statistics today. And you can see that if you look at primary CABGs, that's where 4-to-1 and microplegia are being used most often. Probably everybody in the room here would agree with that. And then if you look at valvular procedures, we see that, again, that tends to migrate more towards the Del Nido and the custodial type of solutions. And at the very bottom, urgent, it probably depends upon what you have ready available at that time. Looking at the bypass times and cross-clamp times, the colors are all consistent for the next several graphs. Red is going to be 4-to-1, green is microplegia, Del Nido is blue, and the crystalloid is yellow. And there's not a real variation, although there was statistical significance. Once you get into this high N number, you find a lot of statistical significance which may not be clinically relevant. But we see that the del nido had the shortest the shortest bypass time and also the shortest cross clamp time. If bypass time was equal, then you could probably state that, yeah, the del nido group is receiving, the surgeon's able to do her surgery a lot faster than she would be able to having to give multiple doses such as 4-to-1 or even microplegia. But that really did not bear out. And if you look at the distribution in the others, the cross clamp times were similar. So let's look at crystalloid solutions. This is where it starts, whoopsie, I'm sorry. This is where it starts becoming interesting. And I'm sorry about the complexity of the graphs here, and also that the x-axis is not the same. So the first thing to point out is that the x and y axes are not labeled the same. And we did that just for demonstrative purposes to show what the graphs were. 4-to-1 blood cardioplegia on the x-axis is the crystalloid cardioplegia, and we can see that we're hovering right above 500 cc's. It's a density graph, so the higher the histogram, the more observations in that group. Custodial, those of you who've used that, what's the dose? Give 2 liters, and then we'll go an hour or more without giving another dose, and sure enough, we've clustered right in that 2-liter area. Down on the left, del nido. What do you give for del nido? You give a liter is what your dose is, and then you hopefully go 40 or 50 minutes. And then finally, a microplegia. You're showing the really reduced values of microplegia. And if you do a box plot of those, on the right-hand side, you're hardly giving any volume at all from a crystalloid perspective, somewhere around 35 to 40 cc's as a median value, as opposed to custodial, which is, again, hovered right at that 2 liters. So, okay, well, what does that mean? If you start looking at what occurs from a time perspective, looking at the x-axis now, we have the bypass time, and you can see this sharp inflections on the left-hand side, which are 4-to-1 in del nido, but then in custodial or microplegia, that graph flattens out. So less volume is given over a longer period of time, not only for bypass, but also for cross-clamp, just showing this relationship. And then, well, what's occurring? We have all of this volume that's going on, and of course we've learned, and marketing individuals had said, oh, give the name microplegia. It's a marketing name, but it's because you're giving less volume. You're concentrating the drug, and you're giving less crystalloid. Well, what is the effect on transfusion? That's what we really want to know. And as I mentioned, there have been a few papers out there, very small studies. Most of the myocardial protection papers are small, they're biased. They're not multi-institutional, they're not RCTs, or if they are, they're RCTs with small numbers. So they really don't make themselves into systematic reviews very easily because they're confounded by all of those statistical problems. So if you look at what occurs with ultrafiltration, the left-hand side shows that in custodial or del nido, 85% and 84% are getting ultrafiltrated, and then 34 to 41 in the other 2 techniques, and the volumes are shown on the right. Now, a red flag goes up in everybody's mind right now because the research that is occurring in the last 2 years has linked the use of ultrafiltration to AKI. So if you're using ultrafiltrators on a regular basis and taking off volume, some people do this. We know that we have work to do in our organization to reduce the number because they're saying, you know what, I'm going to accept a lower hematocrit when I first go on bypass because I'm just going to ultrafiltrate that volume off. And most of the data that has been done in blood management in the last decade has shown if a patient ever drops, ever, during an operative admission below 25, maybe 24 or 25%, bad things happen. Ever. Not, okay, it was during the operation or during ICU time, if it ever drops. So if people are using, seeing hematocrits of 21 or 20, that is linked to poor outcomes in a number of organ beds that are associated with anemia, and that's iatrogenic if you're allowing that to occur via the use of an ultrafiltrator. So bad things are happening, and we know this is an opportunity center for us to improve. Lowest bypass hematocrit. Well, how did you do? You used microplegia or used the other spectrum, custodial. You must have had a big hematocrit. No. Looking at those numbers, these are the lowest recorded bypass hematocrit on almost 17,000 patients, and they're all the same. A lot of caveats, and I'll put the limitations up momentarily, but overall, when you look at a cross-section in America, these are probably pretty similar numbers to what you see in most practice patterns. And then finally, this I think is the most important variable that we should be looking at more so than an isolated hematocrit or hemoglobin level. And this is the hematocrit drift. This is appearing more and more in articles that are published in the thoracic literature and as well as the transfusion literature. It's how big was the drift. And I know this is very complex. The 4 entry points here are OR entry to lowest operation, OR entry to low bypass, post-heparin to low operation, and post-heparin to low bypass. Of course, a lot of people say, my anesthesiologist floods the field. But you can't go by our low hematocrits because our anesthesiologist gives 3 liters before I get on bypass. So a crit comes in at 40. Before I get the patient, he's 30. I get on bypass, I'm 24 or 22. I'm right at that precipice where bad things start to happen. Well, if you look at those changes instead, you can see there's really not a lot of difference other than the custodial group with having the biggest change in hematocrit by bolusing in 2 liters of volume. The last, before we conclude, are red blood cell transfusion rate. And this, of course, you would like to say, well, if you're giving very low amounts of crystalloid solution, your transfusion rates are going to be low. We found a statistically significant change, but in the opposite realm. It was the microplegia group that had the highest transfusion rate associated with giving more red blood cells than other groups. And we'll talk about that in the conclusions, which are right now. Limitations, this is data from an observational registry. Although they're used quite frequently, we have Perform, we have the Australians, we have the STS, there's numerous registries that are publishing on. You do have to identify that. Cardioplegia delivery techniques were not standardized across centers. This was a cross-section of all comers. It's not a longitudinal study, so we don't have outcome measures, and transfusion protocols varied across hospitals. In conclusion, the evolution of myocardial protection techniques occurred at a steady rate over time, but very, very slow. There's little to no geographical standardization. I mentioned the Missouri study of decades ago, and that's even at the hospital level. How many people here have surgeons A who is doing something different than surgeon B in the same hospital? That's kind of ridiculous. Although numerous in vitro studies exist with promising modalities, few have penetrated the clinical environment. And then finally, we were unable to show any hematological benefit of any cardioplegia class, at least in regards to transfusions. And why that is, it probably is due to the fact that if you had to tongue-in-cheek identify something that you can compare cardioplegia techniques to, it probably would be chaos theory. Nonlinear dynamics, it's a state of utter confusion. So with that, I thank you very much for the opportunity to summarize and present on myocardial protection techniques. Thank you.